God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble with its tumult. There was an item in the newspaper a while back. It seems that Mrs. James Mead spotted a pair of men's work boots sticking out from under her bed, and they were moving a little bit. Well, she frantically rushed in and called the police to report an intruder hiding under her bed. Officer Joe Brusatori was the first on the scene. He went in, he grabbed the boots, he gave them a big pull, and from under the bed, out popped 4-year-old Jimmy, who was quite pleased with himself, having pulled a prank on his mother. Mother was not amused, and I'm sure there were consequences. And those of you who are parents will note that I waited until our little ones had left the sanctuary before sharing that story, so as not to give them any ideas. But Jimmy had discovered that being able to frighten someone can give you a feeling of power over them. He might grow up to be one of those kids always carrying around in his pocket a rubber snake or a toy mouse or a plastic spider, just waiting for the moment when he can strike again and recapture that feeling. So many ancient religions were based upon fear. Fear of what the gods or the spirits might do to you or your family or your village if they were angry. The mountain is shaking. The earth is trembling. Dark storm clouds are gathering. We had better whip up some sacrifices before divine punishment comes crashing down upon us. Well, likewise, the celebration of Halloween is very ancient and is built upon a foundation of fear. It dates back to the pre-Christian England and Ireland, when the Celts and the Druids considered this day to be a very important day, marking the end of summer. It marked the end of the growing season, and now the season of hunger and cold and death and darkness was upon them. It was believed that on this night, the souls of all who had died during the preceding year would be judged. Since this process took a long time, the souls who were left waiting their turn were given a degree of freedom to roam their old neighborhoods and homelands, particularly between midnight and dawn. Some believed that these souls would take on the form of witches or toads or demons that would haunt and frighten people, particularly people who had wronged them during their life. Well, as you can imagine, the idea of having spirits roaming the countryside prepared to settle old scores was very unsettling, and people did what they could to protect themselves. It was a good night to gather together with neighbors and friends around a large bonfire, because light was believed to keep the spirits at bay. Some people believed it was prudent to wear a disguise so that the ghosts wouldn't recognize you. And some have suggested that the idea of going house to house for treats may have originated in a community feast where people would go from house to house to collect food for a banquet, because nobody wanted to be alone on a night like that. Well, eventually, St. Patrick came to Ireland and Christianity became established as the dominant faith. And on the church calendar, November the 1st was celebrated as All Saints' Day, a day to remember those who had been killed or martyred for their Christian faith. In Britain, this was also known as All Hallows' Day. And of course, the night before was called All Hallows' Eve, which was eventually shortened into Halloween. And the old traditions connected with that night still persisted. Today, I think most of us see Halloween as an exciting children's holiday. Kids get all dressed up in a costume, perhaps as a creature that they find frightening, or as a superhero so they can feel powerful. And in doing so, will be perhaps a step closer towards mastering some of their fears. I mean, they get to go out in the dark with mom or dad, which is quite an experience in and of itself, and they go from house to house in the neighborhood, and strangers give them candy. Wow, isn't this a wonderful experience? And some of the scariest things they know of, such things as darkness and strangers and weird costumes, are all demythologized into something that is fun. Yes, of course, there are people in the world who will abuse the holiday and go overboard with it. But on the whole, I still think of Halloween as being a nice holiday, and isn't helping our children understand and overcome their fears one of the important roles that we play as parents. Now, of course, back in Bible times, there were lots of things to be concerned about and worried and, yes, even frightened about. There were all the usual things like being attacked by a wild animal, or catching a disease, or having to endure a drought or a famine. And living in a location like Israel, they were surrounded by enemies that also brought worries. During the Exodus, the children of Israel were terrified of the army of Egypt, the army of Pharaoh. And then they got as far as Canaan, and they were terrified of the Canaanites, who they said looked like giants to them. And Gideon feared the Midianites, and Saul feared the Philistines, and David feared Achish of Gath. And it was an age with natural phenomenon that they didn't understand and which they were afraid of. You know, things like earthquakes or an eclipse or a meteor shower. They had no explanation for, and they found all of these things very frightening. Well, these concerns are all reasonable enough, but they were also afraid of things that we would consider unreasonable. For example, in the Psalms, we find the assurance that the sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. Well, taking precautions against sunstroke by day is sensible in that climate. But a concern about the moon causing lunacy, well, that's kind of far-fetched to modern ears. The prophet Isaiah gave his oracle, predicting the destruction of the city of Babylon, and for added effect, told of how this bustling city would be turned into an empty wilderness inhabited by ostriches. And at night, they would hear the spine-chilling call of the hyenas out there in the darkness. And it would be a place where the satyrs, those weird goat demons, would gather to dance, which would obviously have a very negative effect on property values. I mean, there was a lot to be afraid of back in those days. There is quite enough in life to be concerned about without letting our imaginations go wild. Well, there are plenty of things in our own day that produce fear and anxiety. I'll be honest with you, there are times when I simply stop watching the local news because of the stress I feel when I hear about the nightly shootings in Philadelphia. And then if the news were not bad enough, now we have all the political attack ads where opponents are portrayed as being the spawn of Satan. And this morning we take the precaution of wearing our masks because there are still more than 80 people a day coming down with COVID here in Chester County. The numbers are coming down, but it's still a concern till we can get our children vaccinated and the oldest among us can get their booster shots. Now, some people have a wonderful sense of self-awareness and self-understanding. They seem to immediately know exactly what they are feeling and why. Sometimes they call themselves emotionally intelligent. While others of us find our emotions clouded under layers of socially prescribed expectations of should and ought to, and keep a stiff upper lip, and showing emotions is a sign of weakness. Honestly, for some of us, it becomes hard work to uncover just what it is we're feeling and why, and to give our fears a name. The book Unbroken tells the story of Louis Zamperini, who was serving in the Air Force during World War II when his bomber crashed into the Pacific and he was taken captive by the Japanese. Nearing the end of 1944, he noted a deep sense of dread and malaise, a sense of impending doom settling down upon the country of Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor had awoken a sleeping giant and filled it with a terrible resolve. And now, island by island, American forces were steadily closing in on the Japanese homeland. Well, one day he was in a POW work detail that was marched into Tokyo. And as he shuffled along, he saw someone had painted graffiti on a building. It said simply, B-29. He didn't know what that meant, but one of the new captives told him that it was the name of the new American super bomber that could fly higher and faster and carry more bombs than any other plane. And the B-29 could reach the Japanese mainland from the islands the Americans had already captured in the Pacific. So rather than this vague, unsettling phobia, someone had named the elephant in the room. Someone had named the fear that the people were feeling. Well, can we name our fears? Sometimes it's honestly difficult because our feelings get tangled up with our ego and the way we want other people to see us and the way people think we ought to be. Prayer can be helpful in understanding ourselves. Journaling can be helpful in getting to the roots of the problem. Talking with others can be helpful. It can be hard work to cut through all the smoke and mirrors that we protect ourselves with and try to understand the truth about ourselves. But if we can honestly name the fear that we are feeling, then we can own it. We can be realistic about it. Begin to take practical steps to deal with it. With B-29s coming, you can install air raid sirens, construct bomb shelters, take a first aid class, send your children out of the city to live with your aunt out on the farm. If we can honestly name the fears and the anxieties that we are feeling, then we can own them. Then we can be realistic about them. We can begin to take practical steps to deal with them. But as Christians, isn't it sinful to be afraid? Doesn't that show a lack of faith? The Bible says, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. God will direct your paths. Well, let's set that verse aside for just a moment. After all, we are human. It's normal for us to be surprised. It's normal for us to feel overwhelmed by circumstances and things that are happening around us. Just because we call ourselves the children of God or people of faith, it's no guarantee that we will not face troubles or things that we are afraid of. In fact, there are plenty of verses in the Bible that suggest that we really will face fears and troubles. Jesus told the disciples that he was sending them out like lambs into the midst of wolves. Isn't that a graphic picture? When Paul and Barnabas reached Antioch, they encouraged the believers, saying, "It is through many persecutions that we must enter the kingdom of heaven." And he told the church in Philippi, "He has granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but of suffering for him as well." Certainly, remaining obedient to God's laws will steer us away from all kinds of earthly problems. But we are still earthlings living upon this earth, and it would be a mistake to think that God has sealed us in bubble wrap to protect us from every disease, every crime, every disappointment, every hateful word or personal attack. Bad things will happen to us, and what's even worse is when they happen to people we love, our children or grandchildren. But God will be with us as we go through these difficult times. Paul writes, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Will hardship or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or the sword?" As though all of these things should be things that are within the realm of possibility and that may very well attack your life. And then he says, no, in all of these things, we are more than conquerors. We will persevere through him who loved us. And John tells us there is no fear in love, because perfect love, such as what God has for each of us, casts out fear. Yes, we will face difficulties. We will experience loss. Tears will flow. But the good news is that God will be with us through them all. Emmanuel, God is with us. The very moment when we feel most frightened and most alone may be exactly the moment when God is closer than ever. Cast your fears upon him because he cares for you. Now let's take just a moment to stop and to reflect and to ask ourselves if there are fears we may be facing today. Are there things we feel afraid of? Can we name that fear? Can we identify what it is we're really feeling so that we will be prepared to respond with God's help appropriately? Let's take just a moment.